Your dive computer is making decisions that shape your ascent and your decompression risk. But surprisingly, not many truly understand the decisions it's making for them. And marketing of these dive computers will certainly try to sell you on all the bells and whistles. In this video, we'll break down what nobody has told you on what you need to know, understand, and consider before buying a dive computer, regardless of your experience level. I'm Don, a cold water diver and underwater storyteller, and I post weekly scuba diving videos to help you build skills, dive with more confidence, and explore the ocean with curiosity and care. So let's start with the first decision that affects everything, which is the mode before you enter the water. Before you even hit the water, your computer needs to know and support the kind of dive you're doing. This is where operating modes come in and is where the confusion starts. So before we name the modes, here is the mindset that keeps you safe. Plan the dive first, then use the computer to execute and monitor. Know your max depth, know your gas plan, and know your ascent and safety stop plan along with your team. A dive computer won't help you with any of that. Now, let's start with the basics, which is recreational mode, or rather, no decompression diving. Some computers label it as no deco mode, but the idea stays the same and often is abbreviated as NDL. Your computer tracks depth and time, estimates inert gas loading, and shows your NDL as a countdown. Once you pass through your NDL, it is no longer safe to ascend straight to the surface, and you will need to decompress. Basically, required decompression introduces a virtual ceiling and has more risk, which is why recreational diving never goes past the NDL countdown to avoid that risk. If you're not diving deep, there's no point in having extra risk on your dive. It is simple and effective, and it covers most all recreational dives well. Now, here is something many divers notice without understanding the cost. Two buddies on the same dive can see different NDLs on their computer. That is usually driven by differences in the model, conservatism settings, gas settings, and earlier dive profiles. So the first safety habit is always to set up your dive computer before you're diving, or especially during your series of dives. And if you're using nitrox, always setting your gas appropriate to the gas that's in your cylinder. You always want to confirm the correct gas, confirm the correct units, and confirm any conservative option is intentional. Now, let's talk about technical or multi-gas mode, because it changes what the computer is designed to support. And of course, when I talk about these different modes, they're not unique to any particular computer. It's going to be just kind of general phrasing. Different computers might call the mode slightly different things, but I want you to get the general idea. Technical mode is for planned decompression diving with training and a calculated dive plan or another redundant dive computer. You'll have a bunch of dive computers for decompression diving because it's so important that you always have a working one. And often you want matching dive computers. You wouldn't want to have potentially two dive computers disagreeing with each other. But usually this technical diving mode generally supports multiple gases, decompression ceilings, and required stops when the model demands it. But it's important to note, training, planning, and gas discipline are what makes those dives possible and manageable. When you do a technical decompression dive, you can no longer just rise to the surface safely. You have to have all the skills needed to decompress over a long period of time and manage any gear failures that might happen along the way. Having a computer that supports it supports the plan, but does not replace the plan or your training. If you're not doing decompression diving right now, you do not need this mode today. However, if you expect to progress into tech diving, it might not hurt to buy a computer that supports multi-gas. There's usually a price difference, but that difference is usually less than buying a second computer. It's something to consider, but if you never plan on doing tech diving, then it's completely fine to buy one that doesn't support multiple gases. But as I mentioned earlier, tech diving also needs a second dive computer. It's ideal if they're matching, but you can also use two dive computers that don't match and just use one in what they call gauge mode. And you'll usually have a backup plan, meaning that you've planned your dive, and if your calculating dive computer breaks, you'll have a backup in gauge mode and use the plan in your mind to basically still ascend safely with the proper decompression. And what gauge mode is it basically just tells you your depth. It doesn't calculate any of your decompression. It's basically just your depth, a timer, and that's about it. So don't expect it to be beeping at you or anything. It's just there to support your backup dive plan that's going to be written down somewhere or in your head. So there is no strong demand to buy a more expensive computer if you're starting out. As you can see, you collect a number of computers over time the longer you've been diving. Now let's talk about multiple gas switching, because it sounds harder than it really is. Multiple gas switching means your computer can track more than one breathing gas on one dive. If you're using one cylinder, you don't need your computer to support multiple gases. If you're using multiple cylinders, like technical divers use it because they may switch to a richer nitrox mix or pure oxygen during ascent to accelerate their decompression. Each gas changes decompression guidance, so the computer must know what you are breathing. So, do you need multiple gas switching if you're only doing recreational dives? Not really. It's fine to keep things simple at first. But of course, if your computer supports it, you are not locked into a single gas limitations forever. You can grow into advanced nitrox and decompression procedures without replacing your computer. So it's something to think about. You can outgrow your computer, but you can also potentially just use it as a gauge as well. So there's always ways to reutilize some of your computers that were cheaper when you first started diving, and you can still use them even as you become more experienced. But here is the marketing trap that is worth stating clearly and calmly. Some computers advertise 8 or 10 gases, which is more than most divers will ever use. So by capacity, you can realistically grow into. Not capacity, you will never touch. Most divers will use 1 gas. Most tech divers will ever only use 3 gases, normally, for breathing. Using more than that, you are looking at the deeper echelons and depth of diving. Now, let's just take a minute to talk about gauge mode just a little bit more, because it can confuse divers who accidentally select it. Gauge mode turns the computer into a depth gauge and timer without decompression guidance, as I mentioned earlier. It will not track inert gas loading, and it will not show no decompression limits. It is useful when you are following tables or a separate plan with proper training. Gauge mode can also appear after a lockout on some computers, after you've violated some of its internal rules and it thinks you shouldn't dive anymore. But lockout behavior varies by brand, so you should learn how your specific model behaves if you get locked out. Not all brands lock you out, so it's important to note that this is a specific feature that some computers force on you, whether you like it or not. Some may think it's added safety, you shouldn't be diving, and some may say that it's up to you to decide if you should or shouldn't. Lockout mode can be a very controversial feature itself. It's the dive computer's way of saying you messed up badly, so the dive computer is not going to allow you to dive anymore. But the easiest way to avoid being locked out is by observing safe diving practices. But it can be a bit of a pill to swallow that your expensive dive computer is telling you you're done inflexibly. But again, not all dive computers will lock you out. So decide if that's a deal breaker for you. If you miss a required stop or violate a ceiling, treat that as a serious event regardless, not because your dive computer is telling you. But one note, if you are diving with multiple computers as one as a backup, it might be good to consider that you want matching dive computers, because if one is more conservative than the other, it might lock you out, even though the other one says you're still in the clear, which is a bummer, temporarily losing a dive computer in that case. Finally, some computers offer free diving mode as a bonus for breath-holding divers. Free diving mode tracks depth and surface intervals between breath hold dives. If you only scuba dive, it's not that important, so do not let it sway your choice in that case. So here's a grounded takeaway, and it keeps you safer. Most of your diving will be recreational with a slow ascent and a 3-minute safety stop. Everything else is either future-proofing for later goals or features you can ignore safely. And if you're enjoying this video, now is a great time to like and subscribe. If you find this information valuable, share it with others. And by the way, if you're interested in being up to date with the latest and greatest in the scuba diving industry, from new gear to new events, I have a free monthly newsletter that you can subscribe to in the description. Check it out and I'll see you there. Moving on, now that we know what a computer is trying to do, here is the next question. Can you read it quickly, operate it cleanly when you are task loaded and wearing gloves? Now, let's talk about what you actually see underwater, because readability supports good decisions. The best dive computer in the world does not help you if you cannot read the numbers quickly. This is where divers buy what looks great on land, then regret it quickly underwater. The manufacturers love to advertise color screens like TFT or OLED because they look pretty premium, and that technology is sold with a lot of smartphones. However, what it means underwater is contrast, brightness control, and viewing angle. In some conditions, a high contrast monochrome display can be easier to read. In other conditions, a well-tuned color display is excellent and very clear. At depth, where ambient light is filtered and blue shifted, contrast becomes everything. In bright tropical sunlight at the surface, some displays wash out if they are not bright enough. So the key is finding what works for your environment and not what looks best in the shop or on land. If you can, it's good to see how the screen performs underwater or read reviews from divers in similar conditions. Now, let's talk about screen layout, because this is where usability matters every dive. Your computer should show current depth, elapsed dive time, and your no decompression limit clearly. You shouldn't have to search around for that stuff. Everything else is secondary, including temperature, compass, and cylinder pressure with wireless integration. Those extras are useful, but they should not clutter your main numbers you rely on. Some computers let you customize the main screen, while others lock the screen, and this is what you're going to have to live with. If you want control, check customization before you buy and confirm it is easy to use and set up. And more importantly, that it looks familiar and quick to read. There is nothing worse than needing information quickly while it is buried behind button presses. Although, word of warning that most dive computers have quite some menus, albeit some easier to use than others. They all like to bury stuff in menus. Now, let's talk about buttons, because gloves can turn small design choices into real problems. If buttons are tiny or too close together, it is easy to hit the wrong one. You want buttons that are large enough for gloves and space to reduce mistakes, especially if you dive cold water with thick gloves. Some computers use one-button navigation, which can be slow and error-prone underwater. Button intuitiveness matters even more if you are ever needing to confirm a gas switch during a real dive. So you want it to be very easy to use, and ideally maybe play around with it at the shop for your own buying needs before you commit. Configuration complexity also varies widely, and it affects whether you set the computer correctly. Some computers are intuitive, and you can set nitrox percentage and conservatism quickly, which you want those two settings to always be fairly easy to change, because you might be changing them decently frequently, depending on your diving conditions. Others require nested menus for simple changes, which increases mistakes and frustration. Like, don't even get me started on why there's two separate modes, air and nitrox, and you can't switch between them on some computers once you start diving. Ugh, that is a feature to consider not buying. If your computer doesn't allow you to switch between nitrox and air once you start diving, avoid it. That is the worst pain, because really, nitrox mode is just a gas, and you can change to 21%, which is air, at any time. It just doesn't make sense. But anyways, that's one of the frustrations that you might experience on your dive computers, and a consideration of what to look for. If you adjust settings often, make sure the interface does not fight you each time. And once you trust the screen and controls, your next decision becomes physical and practical. What shape of computer do you want on your wrist, and what are the trade-offs that come with it? Now we get to a choice that looks simple, but affects everything you do underwater. You are choosing between a full-size dive computer or a watch-style computer generally. But let's take a quick look at computers built into your regulator. There are some computers that attach to your high-pressure line from your regulator, which have some benefits, being that they always know your gas pressure, and they're always fairly easy to find. You never need to worry about forgetting it either. However, due to their location, usually being around the hip and waist area, they are not the easiest to see. And if in an emergency, the location of it may not be easy to get to. And what's critical is you can see your depth easily. So you always want to see your depth easily. And so the wrist, ideally the right wrist, is the general location you want your dive computers, because your left hand is going to be used for your inflator hose. So that's why, at least for your main dive computer, I recommend a wrist mounted dive computer. Otherwise, a backup might be fine on your high pressure line otherwise. It does have some benefits, but I do think it's a safer option to go with wrist mounted computer for at least your main computer, and ideally on your right arm. That way you can always see your depth easily. Now, looking at the traditional wrist mounted computer or console, it gives you a larger screen and easier button operation that can be often held in your eyesight when it's most needed. These larger dive computers provide longer battery life, which can matter on a multi-day dive travel or longer decompression dives. Of course, the trade-off is bulk, because it is not something most people wear casually, so you need to put it on before your dive intentionally. It also takes up more space in your gear bag, especially when you're trying to pack light. Watch-style computers are compact and easy to travel with, and many divers wear them. And some may like it because you probably won't forget it. You just are always wearing it, and if you start your dive, it's probably going to be there. To which my thoughts are, you would probably put on a wetsuit anyway, so you're probably going to take it off. So I'm not entirely sure that argument holds, but that's part of the argument. But as an added bonus, dive watches can be more like a smartwatch and have a bunch of other features, including fitness tracking, activity tracking for daily life, reminders, notifications from your phone. But all that does come at the cost of battery life and some complexity, maybe bugs in its ecosystem. And of course, it means they have to charge it fairly frequently. Also, the smaller size means smaller text and smaller buttons, which can be harder than gloves. That can be a real issue in certain environments like cold water, low visibility, or high task load. So if you pick a watch style for convenience on land, confirm you like it underwater. Even with the perfect form factor for you, you still have not answered the main safety question. What model is generating the guidance you follow? And how conservative is it in your hands? Here is what drives decompression guidance, and this is the part that shapes your margins. Everything we discussed so far is interface, but the decompression model and settings generate the advice. All decompression models are approximations that reduce risk, but they never eliminate risk food. That is why your scent behavior, workload, cold, and decisions still matter on every dive. The dive computer won't know or replace any of that. Cold, heavy workload, dehydration, and long repetitive days are reasons to choose more conservatism. And if this concept is new for you, I did make a video that explains it well up here. You can check that out next. But one of the most common algorithms is the Bowman ZHL16, often seen as ZHL16C or B. Many technical focused computers allow gradient factors, which are a way to adjust conservatism for this exact algorithm. Bowman is widely used and predictable when you understand the settings you are running. However, how conservative feels depend on the manufacturer defaults and your chosen settings. Another common approach is the reduced gradient bubble model, often called RGBM, which has several variations depending on the brand implementing it. While the Bowman algorithm primarily focuses on tracking dissolved gas levels in your tissues to prevent oversaturation, RGBM is a bubble model that additionally calculates the formation and growth of microbubbles, often resulting in more conservative profiles. And many implementations add extra conservatism on repetitive and multi-day dive patterns. They may also penalize profiles with frequent depth changes and repeated ascents. Brands may also modify an existing model or add conservatism without fully explaining the details. Regardless, if the model behavior is transparent and documented, it is easier to dive deliberately. If it is a black box, you are trusting it without understanding how the settings change guidance. So something to keep in mind on how much that matters to you. Almost all dive computers will be safe. It is just to what degree and how safe that may be that differs. The purpose of a dive computer is to give you information so you can dive safely and reduce risk on every dive. And they're all trying to do that the best they can. Some are just more transparent on how that's happening. Gradient factors are one important feature where divers tune conservatism when using Bowman-based systems. You adjust low and high factors to shape stop depth and surfacing margin. A setting like 70/85 is generally more conservative than many defaults, while a setting like 70/95 is generally less conservative depending on the dive profile. The right values depend on training, environment, workload, risk tolerance, but most importantly, you can tune them intelligently to your environment and how you feel. The power is yours, and that empowers you to make a new level of control and input to your model to shape your definition of risk and safety on your dives, which is a really nice thing. Your computer doesn't know what's happening on your dive, you do. And being able to shape that decision intelligently puts safety in your hands. I do have a video that goes into more detail on gradient factors here if you'd like to know more. But if your computer supports them, you can grow into control as you gain experience. Some computers, instead of showing direct gradient factors, show a tissue loading indicator or bar graph that helps you see trends. It's essentially the same thing, just more of a visual representation versus a percentage. Treat that display as a simplified indicator, not a literal view of your body. Other computers show only no decompression limits and prompts, which can be enough if simply recreational diving. I personally do find that the large graphs are a little bit distracting, but it's a personal preference. I rather just see it as a number, a percentage. The screen real estate is important, and I try to cram as much stuff on there as I can. But again, my preference. Throughout this video, I'll be sure to show you a whole bunch of different UIs so you can kind of start getting an idea of what to look for in the UI and what you might want to see on your dive computer. And of course, more information can be useful, but only if it stays readable and it is not distracting for you. A computer reduces risk, but is not a guarantee. Your behavior still matters. Now, once the model is set, alarms are how the computer gets your attention when something matters. The important alarms are ascent rate, misstop, decompression ceiling, and high oxygen exposure. A low no decompression warning can be useful, and a low battery warning matters more than people think. Do not turn off safety alarms just because they are annoying, and do not ignore them underwater. I will admit some of these dive computers, not to mention any names, can be pretty alarming, and that can get annoying. But it's better to be annoying than be unsafe. One super nice feature for dive computers are silent alarms that vibrate you instead of annoying the pants off of your surrounding divers. That's a really nice feature, and something that I personally prefer. There's nothing like an experience of being around a bunch of divers with a whole bunch of alarms going off. It's kind of a magical experience that I would wish on nobody. So let's take a minute and talk about redundancy. For the longest time, I only used one dive computer, and that can be okay with recreational diving. But nowadays, and not looking back, I generally dive with two computers, sometimes one stuffed in a pocket just in case, so it's tracking my dive profile still, or I'll have both on my arms, visible. It helps because maybe you're on a trip on a liveaboard and something happens to one of your dive computers. No problem. I have another one that's been tracking all my dives. It's calculated everything personal to me, and it's ready to go and keeping me safe. And the model knows everything it needs to know to help calculate my NDL for the next dive. And if one fails, still have another working computer, you can continue to dive. If you only have one dive computer and it fails, no problem. You usually have a buddy nearby who will use their dive computer in the dive and go up safely. But then if you're on the liveaboard, you have to figure out where you're going to start tracking your next dives. I wouldn't personally advise it, even though technically you can use tables, but I generally never dive without a dive computer nowadays. Call it lazy, call it a dislike for tables. The tables were a good thing at a time, but we have plenty of dive computers nowadays, and it's good to just use a dive computer, in my opinion. So just some food for thought. And if your dives require stage decompression as a tech dive, a reliable backup is not an option. It is part of the plan, as mentioned before. You either need an engage mode and a backup plan written down or in your mind, or you can use two redundant computers that are ideally the similar model. Now, let's get practical because reliability matters just as much as the features. This is where batteries, mounts, software, and build quality make or break your experience. Now, let's get into the practical details that make owning a computer easier and more reliable. Start with the strap, because fit changes dramatically when you add exposure protection. Most computers ship with a strap that fits bare wrists or wetsuits fairly well. I'd be shocked if it didn't. With a dry suit and thick undergarments, that strap may not fit or may sit awkwardly, even be a beast to put on. Some brands, of course, include extenders, while others expect you to buy them separately. A common dry suit solution is a bungee mount, which is elastic and easy to manage. It stretches over your suit and then sits snug on your wrist without buckle fiddling. Not all computers support bungee mounts directly, so check your mounting options before buying and decide if you have preferences. I personally like bungees on a compass, so I can have it on my hand or on my wrist, but I generally like to have my computer kind of sit in a very stable spot, and so I generally like a thicker wristband for my computers. But that is just a personal preference. And of course, they also have these clip mounting ones that kind of buy you options. You can move these around separately and have options, but you might find that these little buckles can be hard to use sometimes in the cold or with thick gloves on. So some considerations. There's nothing that's gonna be perfect. You're going to have to try a couple options. So you have the bungee system, you have this clip system, and then you have this traditional band. And these can be a little challenging with dry suits, these bands. And so generally you'll switch to either a clip system or bungee system for dry suits. But if these are long enough, you can make these work for a dry suit as well. If you use an aftermarket strap or bungee, size it so it's secure, but not overly tight. Too tight can restrict circulation, and too loose can let it shift around, which is never fun if you just always look at your dive computer and flip the other direction. Now, let's talk about batteries, because convenience can often become a failure point during travel. User replaceable batteries are a major reliability advantage for remote locations and trips. Many computers use common coin cells like CR2032 or AA's, or even long-lasting lithium AA's. If a battery is low before a trip, you can often swap it out yourself very quickly. You can see here a quick example of how easy it is to get into this battery compartment, and how not as easy it is to get into this battery compartment of this dive computer. Some are just easier to change and swap out batteries than others. But it's also interesting to think about how long the dive computer will last on this battery. Like this thing, I usually have to change out the battery like once every 2 years or so, and it keeps going for quite some time. While this one, it uses battery consumption quite a bit faster, but at a rate that is not annoying. And I can just change the battery on the fly because I always have a battery in my Save a Dive kit. And then, of course, you have different models that are chargeable, like this one and this one. And they usually come with an induction pad where you basically plug in the induction pad and it charges these through the pad when you sit it on the induction pad. And so that's pretty cool. But if something happens to that battery, then there goes your dive computer. Those are not easy to replace. It's basically one and the same. So there are some pros to having a rechargeable battery. In fact, there's sometimes I wish I'll just use a rechargeable battery dive computer. So it's nice, I guess, if you have options. Of course, I'm not suggesting you buy all of them, but kind of play around with it, and hopefully this video helps you get an idea of what might be good for you. There's pros and cons. Then you can change it on your own quickly and easily. This one lasts forever. You can change it on your own, but not quite as easily. And these, no problem. You can keep charging it until maybe someday, which will be a very disappointing day, that doesn't turn on anymore. And it's worth noting that rechargeable batteries generally don't last as long. They're kind of expecting it that it's easier to charge, so you can charge it more frequently. I generally don't like to charge dive computers during a dive trip. I find like dive watches to be super annoying. They have to charge them almost every day. And so my personal preference is I like a battery to at least last as long, maybe a couple weeks of diving as much as you can every single day. And that's just my preference. You can have your own, but some food for thought. And it's worth noting that some models require standard connectors, and others use proprietary cables and charging pads that could be easy to lose. So you can factor that into how you charge your dive computer as well. And of course, depending on the design, battery replacement may require service rather than a simple swap. You could try it on your own, but generally the recommendation could be they have to get a service, which is a bit of a pain. And it's important to note on the box, usually the battery life claims are generally for warm water, and cold water, it can generally be a lot faster. Ultimately, I've owned all the variations. They have the pros and cons. I'm still not sure which I like more, the rechargeable one or the one you can change yourself. But I will say the one you can change yourself does give you the most flexibility. If the battery is bad or dying, no problem. Swap it out, you're done. Now, let's talk about air integration, because it is one of the most common buying questions. Here's the practical catch that surprises people after they buy it. Air integration transmitters will attach to your regulator and read the pressure from your cylinder, like an SPG, and transmit it wirelessly to your dive computer. And you can see your gas consumption rates and your gas that's remaining in your cylinder on your dive computer. That's pretty cool. But the important note here is air integration transmitters rarely work across brands of dive computers. So think of an air integration as an extension of your computer's ecosystem, not a universal add-on. You would think they'd all just get along and talk to each other. That isn't the case. But there are some extra bells and whistles into different air integrations, and depending on the model, it can show cylinder pressure, pressure trends, and sometimes gas remaining based on your breathing rate. It can be great for awareness and statistics in the dive log, but you still need to be disciplined on your gas checks and have a solid dive plan. Air integration is usually straightforward, but more competitive sensors do better about ensuring signal is dropped less and may have other bells and whistles like GPS tracking for your dive logs. That's kind of cool. Now, let's talk about build quality of the dive computer, because durability is what you pay for beyond features. Plastic housings are common, lightweight, corrosion resistant, and they can last for years. Stainless steel housings can be tougher, but they can show corrosion in salt water over time. Titanium is light, strong, and highly corrosion resistant, but it usually costs more. Of course, seal integrity matters as well, because buttons and charging areas are water ingress risks. You always want to rinse your computer, keep seals clean, and take flooding reports from other reviews seriously. These can be sneaky in most reviews, but of course these can be a little sneaky for dive computers because they often don't pop up for many dives later. Most seasoned brands have seals figured out well and usually are quite reliable. I mean, this is a safety device, and a lot of time and attention is usually put into making sure they are reliable, but that's not a guarantee. Now, let's talk about software, because your computer does not exist in isolation anymore. It's all about the ecosystem. Most computers sync to a phone via Bluetooth or computer, so you can review logs and update firmware. Some apps are stable and well maintained, while others are buggy and unreliable. Before you buy, you can always download the app and give it a whirl. Check for updates, platform support, real user experience with syncing. It can be a missed piece of the ecosystem in reviews, and it matters more to some than others. I specifically know a lot of divers who like to finish a dive, upload their logs to their phone, and review them on their phone after a dive. And that's a neat feature, and it's becoming more popular. So if your dive computer doesn't support that, it might be a bummer for you. For me personally, I really don't care. So you'll see that there's no perfect dive computer for everyone. And so this is really just a food for thought for you to decide how important that is to you. If you want a great experience, automatically syncing your dives, seeing the data and tracking the information, it would be good to do research on the app first and factor it into your buying decision. And logbook reliability matters because some computers store detailed profiles and others fill up quickly. If you want a long-term record and basically use your dive computer as that long-term record, confirm storage capacity and export options on that dive computer first. Cloud syncing can be convenient, but it adds dependence on manufacturer servers and accounts, which sometimes can be an additional monthly fee. Also something to look into before overcommitting into that ecosystem. Finally, consider depth ratings. Most dive computers can go pretty deep. What's the purpose of a dive computer if not to go down with you? But pay attention to that depth rating because you want plenty of headroom and you want to stay way conservative below that maximum depth. Some devices are rated to 40 meters or 130 feet, and others are deeper down to 100 meters or 330 feet or more. The point is not to chase depth, but to keep the device within its tested range, and generally way conservative in that. Stay within your training, your plan, and your personal limits on every dive. And of course, I have to mention about closed circuit rebreathers, CCRs. Your computer must support your CCR, so that might be an easy buying decision in some cases. One interesting thing is you might buy a nice dive computer and grow to the point where you're now thinking of getting a CCR. your CCR has to support that dive computer, which probably doesn't, because usually CCRs support one dive computer. So my recommendation is find a CCR for you and then buy whatever dive computer is basically supporting that ecosystem. It could be their own custom one or a partner relationship. But generally, your options for dive computers are very limited based on the CCR you're going to buy. But anyways, just a quick note on CCRs because I couldn't be complete without mentioning. But ultimately, when your setup supports your diving, every dive is your adventure. Set your computer correctly, understand what the model is doing, and keep your habits conservative, and you'll be diving for years to come. What is your key feature in your dive computer that you cannot do without? Let me know in the comments below. If you're looking to dive deeper and understand what is valuable to you in your primary scuba diving kit, check out this playlist here. Otherwise, YouTube thinks you might like this one over here. Give it a try. The more you know, the more you'll love and protect the ocean. Until next time.